Mr. Sanis, let me ask you, were you a scared, reluctant Army volunteer draftee in July 1965?
Yes.
Were you a dedicated inductee into the National Security Agency?
Absolutely, yes.
Were you an NSA counterintelligence agent in Vietnam?
Yes, for 3 tours.
Were you an NSA electronic eavesdropper on the CIA's dirty wars in Southeast Asia?
Yes.
Were you an aerospace company engineer and then a designer and builder of nightclubs and restaurants who was an anti-war activist?
Yes.
Were you America's mole inside FBI bombing and obstruction of justice plots?
I was indeed.
Were you the whistleblower who alerted the American public to the criminal conduct of the FBI and the cover-up by the U.S. Department of Justice headed by John Mitchell?
At all relevant times in this discourse, that was my motive, that was my objective, that was my plan, and that's what I carried out.
Were you the man who forced the convening of a federal grand jury to hear his unimmunized testimony to FBI-directed participation in conspiracies to commit bombing, felony murder, and multiple counts of obstruction of justice?
Yes, on June 20th, 1972, according to my criminal attorney, I voluntarily confessed without immunization to more than 800 years worth of minimum sentences, if staged consecutively, worth of crimes on behalf of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's operations to smear anti-war movement individuals, to smear racial minorities, and to smear people who were opposed to the Republican re-election of Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Mr. Sanis, were you the man whose sworn affidavits were utilized in the quashing of 37 federal felony indictments?
I am that man.
And, Mr. Sanis, were you the man who was instrumental in obtaining the public confessions of 2 other men who had been bombers for the FBI?
I was. One of them I took away from the FBI safe house in Ballard, a suburb or an area of the city of Seattle, Washington. And that was Desmond Jeffrey Paul, who had carried out several bombings on behalf of the FBI. In October of 1970, by going to the offices of the defense groups that were assisting, and I'd gone there many times before, in the guise of a fundraiser for these 3 groups, which is the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. At that time, I knew when I gave him those files in the second meeting that I was dealing with the FBI, but not the FBI field office that I'd been doing espionage work for in Seattle prior to that time. I knew this was a separate and distinct operation. And it was only nearly 2 years later that I found out that the man who was a senior FBI agent from Washington, D.C. was not an FBI agent. He was a counterintelligence agent for Richard Milhouse Nixon's White House plumbers group. He was E. Howard Hunt. And I knew this only after two, if I remember correctly, of the four Watergate burglars on the night of June 16th, 1972, had entered into the offices of Lawrence O'Brien, been arrested as the Watergate burglars, as I'll elaborate on a little later, and had in two of their pockets the name E. Howard Hunt with his White House telephone number. And he was implicated in the Watergate burglary as a leader of it, along with G. Gordon Liddy. But I only knew his real name said over a year and a half later, when that information came out of Watergate. I was not surprised that I've been not dealing with a man operating under his own name, because he had asked me to undertake a criminal enterprise for him on behalf of the federal government.
Mr. Sanas, tell me about the March 8th, 1971 burglary of over 800 secret documents from the Medea, Pennsylvania office of the FBI.
That burglary, that break-in, that theft of FBI documents was for the purpose of implicating, by their own words, by their own documents, J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigations organization in criminal activities that they were undertaking, to my knowledge, to my direct knowledge, and to my direct involvement in attacking the anti-Vietnam War movement and its members, and in attacking people who were in favor of minority rights in this country.
Mr. Sanas, tell me why the White House counterintelligence agents of President Richard M. Nixon broke into the Watergate office of Larry O'Brien, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, on June 16, 1972.
I should append to my discussion of the break-in of the Medea office of the FBI that no one was ever caught for that burglary, which I regard as an act of extraordinary patriotism and extraordinary courage. I will say no more about that because I don't know what the status is from a criminal law standpoint of that Medea, Pennsylvania break-in. But I am happy to tell you that I did personally and alone mastermind, if you will, a break-in of the FBI offices in Seattle, Washington. And at that time that I did that, it was a simple thing to do, but an extraordinary thing to know about for people today. When I did it, it was very simply done. The offices were in the federal building, downtown Seattle. I simply took two large shopping bags, one in each hand, into the federal building lobby in Seattle. I went to the elevator tower, got into the elevator tower, went up to the offices of the FBI office, and stayed inside the stairway. Stayed inside the stairway by the elevator towers and waited there until a little after noon. 3 FBI agents together came from the elevator over to the door, which had a plate glass viewing port by it, and they waved and a woman inside the FBI offices hit a buzzer. The door was unlocked from the FBI office to the elevator lobby, and the 3 FBI agents walked in. Before the door closed behind them, I darted from the stairway where I was watching out of a small crack in the door, burst in behind them with my shopping bag in each hand, and screamed, "Freeze, motherfuckers," at the top of my voice. At that moment, these brave and courageous FBI agents who filled that office floor saw who I was. They knew who I was. They knew I was an explosives expert. They knew I was a man with long history of building and setting bombs for my government. They fled like little children, screaming, breaking furniture, pushing past secretaries, leaping over secretaries, and all of them turned to screaming people, fleeing their own offices to get out as I just stood there, quietly. They totally emptied the office of the FBI on that floor within a matter of less than 30, 40 seconds. Now that's a federal crime. It's a lot of federal crimes to plan and execute a break-in of the FBI office in Seattle. But they fled. They didn't turn around to put me at gunpoint arrest. They're afraid I had bombs in those 2 shopping bags. All I had was 2 shopping bags full of sworn affidavits of FBI involvement in criminal activities in pursuit of people of color and in pursuit of people who protested the war in Vietnam. They fled. I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. And so I sat on a nearby desk by the front door, crossed my legs, held out my hands, put them to the side of me on each side of the desk, palms down, and waited. It was many, many, many minutes after that when the first of 2 Seattle policemen low-crawled their way into that office and at gunpoint arrested me without resistance. But it was intriguing to me when I got down to the lobby that their Seattle police car was parked on the sidewalk directly in front of the doors of the federal building that they had entered and gone up the elevator from. The FBI agents, those brave, sworn agents of our federal government, of all of us, had in their courage called the Seattle office of the Seattle Police Department to come collect me or deal with me, whatever it took, in the federal building of the United States in downtown Seattle. I was cuffed, taken into the back seat by one of the officers who sat next to me, billy club at port arms, and I was very quiet, very demure, very meek, except as we neared Seattle's headquarters of the police department, I did observe to both of them very calmly that they should be thinking about why it was that they were called, the Seattle Police Department, for a break-in of the offices of the FBI in the federal building. Why federal agents had not responded to gun me down or take me into custody, whatever. Didn't they think that was unusual? And then I asked them, because they said nothing, either one of them. And I said, I have to tell you something. you really haven't arrested me. And you will be told when we get to the jail that I am not under arrest, I have not been under arrest, and I simply came voluntarily with you to talk to you about an incident at the federal building. You will be told to take my cuffs off and release me. I will never make it to jail. At that point, they became agitated, understandably, and we had a tense ride the rest of the way and a tense entry into the jail section of downtown Seattle Police Department office. They were met by a senior Seattle police officer who told them to release me and let me go, that I was not under arrest and had not been under arrest. And my last words to the policeman were, "Did I not tell you? Don't you find this a little unusual?" Now that burglary I can tell you all about, and I'm happy to.
Mr. Sanis, on June 16th, 1972, the night of the famous Watergate wiretapping and burglary incident, were you already scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury in Seattle, Washington?
Yes. On the night of the Watergate burglary, I was scheduled 4 days later, on the 20th of June, 1972, to testify before a federal grand jury that I had forced the convening of by very unusual means, and which I write about, and you can find at www.darkmattermotor.com or under FBI Dirty Wars on the internet. And the reason that the Watergate break-in occurred was directly because of my testimony scheduled before a federal grand jury that I'd forced the convening of, that I gave 4 days later on June 20th, 1972. I voluntarily testified without grant of immunity to criminal acts, including criminal conspiracies of a wide variety, of burglary, of conspiracy to commit first-degree bombing, obstruction of justice charges of all kinds, that if I were convicted of each and every one of those accounts of criminal violation, I would have had an aggregate of well over 800 years in a federal penitentiary if they just added the minimum terms for each of those counts that I testified to having committed. The reason that I did those crimes was because I had infiltrated the Federal Bureau of Investigation after I had found and did an investigation of and determined that a bombing in the United States Post Office at 43rd and University Way in Seattle on March 3rd, 1970 had been carried out at the direction of FBI Special Agent Lewis M. Harris, Jr. of the Seattle office of the FBI. And I knew that Lewis M. Harris, Jr. was not working alone, because by surveilling him shortly after that burglary, I knew that his partner was the deputy in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Seattle office under the leadership of J. Earl Mills, and that was Bert Carter, who was the ASAC, Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI Seattle office, and the partner of Lewis M. Harris, Jr. By surveillance of both of them that I conducted, I knew they had been involved in not only the bombing of the United States Post Office on University Way at 43rd, on the night of March 3rd, 1970, but I also knew that they had been involved in the bombing earlier on the 28th of February, 1970, of the construction site of the University of Washington Architecture Building at the University of Washington in Seattle, just 3 blocks away. That, if I remember correctly from many years ago, was on 40th at University Way, between University Way and Brooklyn. I also knew that this pair then was involved in a bombing of the University of Washington Administration Building in 1969. My great concern was that in the bombing at the University of Washington Administrative Building, or Administration Building, more correctly, in 1970, that a policeman in his car was jarred and certainly traumatized when his car moved sideways, literally moved sideways as he was sitting in it, by the violence of the dynamite blast at the University of Washington Administration Building. I also knew that at the University of Washington's architecture construction site, that building had been subjected to, on the 28th of February 1970, 2 bombings. One worked. The second bomb, a much larger bomb, was hidden in a stack of lumber by a man named Jeffrey Paul Desmond, who built the bombs for that, who also built the bomb that led to the murder of a man named Larry Ward at another bomb site later. But I also knew that these 2 FBI agents were conspirators in all of these bombings except the one that hadn't happened, that of Larry Ward. So I knew that I was dealing with elements of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their sworn agents, special agents of the FBI, including the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI, Bert Carter. I was dealing with people who had planned and executed bombings, and most heinously to me, the second bomb that was set did not go off in the University of Washington's Architecture Building construction site, was meant to kill, maim, damage responding Seattle police department officials and Seattle Fire Department officials when they responded to that first blast. And as I have talked about and written about at length, on the night of March 4th, 1970, while I was having a late breakfast from an almost 24-hour construction effort to finish the completion of a very large nightclub, also a few blocks away from the bombing site at the post office. It was on (47th) at about 3 blocks from University Way, and on Old Highway 99, and that if people were doing all of these bombings and they were FBI agents, then I should do something about it, because I am a bombing expert and have been, and was a bomb expert for the Federal Bureau of Investigation after that and before that for the National Security Agency in 3 tours of combat in Vietnam.
Mr. Sanis, in connection with your grand jury testimony on that date, what role did Deputy U.S. Attorney General Guy Goodwin play?
Guy Goodwin, a United States of America, Deputy Attorney General, played no role. He sat silent. I testified to that federal grand jury without a question from the Deputy U.S. Attorney General. The U.S. Attorney General had been ordered to supply a Deputy U.S. Attorney General by the presiding judge of the 6th District Federal Court, William T. Beeks, in Seattle, after he had heard me telling about my work for the FBI. And when this grand jury testimony took place 4 days after Watergate break-in, I had to recount all of my work that I could remember on behalf of the FBI in carrying out bombing attacks, in planning bombing attacks, in obstructing justice, etc., etc., etc. For this, if they took the minimum counts or minimum sentences for each of these counts and added them consecutively, it had been well over 800 years. The Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Guy Goodwin, sat silent in that hearing room the entire hours of my testimony. Those records have never been unsealed, and they would verify my testimony if applied for under Freedom of Information Act by the American Civil Liberties Union or anyone who cared to. But Guy Goodwin sat silent. He, 2 years after this, almost, was part of the Watergate cover-up. And that's where I also know him from. He was one of those who covered up Watergate.
Mr. Sanis, do you think that any of the Watergate burglars or any of the Nixon White House plumbers knew that they were breaking into the Democratic National Committee offices as part of a conspiracy to cover up the truth of your testimony 4 days later to the federal grand jury in Seattle?
I am positive that none of those people, including E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, would have known of that, because the conspiracy that I had entered into with agents of the FBI also went directly up to the level of and included the Attorney General John N. Mitchell of the United States under Richard Milhouse Nixon. And I knew that Attorney General John N. Mitchell and Nixon were involved in directing my activities, and as I found out much later, much later, from the theft of a document from FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. by people unknown to me, and which I will include as an exhibit to this discussion. It is a chart of my involvement and those that I reported to in the FBI, Burt Carter and Lewis M. Harris Jr., and my direct link to their supervisor in all of these criminal activities went to a man who we now know as Deep Throat, who was using Watergate to cover up the more deadly White House horrors. And I was the chief problem of the White House horrors. And that whole help by the head, the number 2 man of the FBI, but the head of counterintelligence activities in the United States, was to cover up his involvement, the man we now know as Deep Throat, and the involvement of senior FBI agents and of Nixon and of Attorney General John N. Mitchell in carrying out bombings, wiretappings, etc., 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 obstruction of justice plots to diminish the influence of, the credibility of, and members of the anti-war movement and people who were fighting for civil liberties in the United States, and to re-elect Richard Milhouse president for a second term in November 1972. What they wanted to do was keep the plot together enough until the election results were in, and then they had a whole series of spins that involved me in my testimony as being not credible because I was, at relevant times in the Vietnam War and my service there, an agent of the Chinese Communist government. That was their fallback plan if my information came out before the election. And what were they worried about? They were worried about a single tape recording that I had made of Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Seattle office of the FBI, Burt Carter, as he ordered me to commit a mass casualty terrorist attack on United States soil by the bombing of the Evergreen Point floating bridge, with sufficient explosives used by me to set one end of the pilings, break them off, and set free the Evergreen Point floating bridge where joined the area of the University of Washington Arboretum, that area. To set that free, which would have broken the connection of the bridge at the other end and would have broken pieces into deadly last places of life for thousands of people who were using the bridge, and because I was to carry out this attack at a rush hour during high wind and rain moments, so as to create maximum casualties. As soon as I had that tape, I left working for the FBI and worked for a period of a great number of months before I went public. The reason for that was to try and stay alive. I was young. I wanted to live. I wanted to stop Nixon. I wanted to stop the FBI from committing crimes against the American people. But I didn't want to live. Now, I'm a man with many years. And on June 7th this year, I had my 8th stroke. I have not long to live. And as always, I'm willing to die for my country.
Mr. Sanis, could you tell me when, where, and why you decided to infiltrate FBI's clandestine bombing and other terrorist activities inside the United States?
Yes. On the evening of March 4th, as I mentioned earlier in this recording, 1970, I was a few blocks away at 47th and University Way, and I picked up 2 newspapers, as I always did every day, the Seattle Times and Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and I was reading their lead articles about a bombing that had taken place about 5 minutes after 10 on the night before, on the 3rd. And as I read the accounts in both the Seattle Times and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, it didn't add up. Because at that time I was putting the last touches on completion of a construction project that I had designed and was in charge of building. That is a facility called the District, a very large nightclub, seating and standing over 800 people at a time. It was the nearest watering hole to the University of Washington campus. And as I read the accounts, as an expert in bombing, explosives, incendiaries, of every kind of counter-espionage trick in the world, been highly trained, and having had 3 tours of combat utilizing these skills, having built over 1,500 bombs minimum for the National Security Agency to protect our communications equipment and codes in the Republic of Vietnam over that 3-tour of duty period in 1966, 1967, and early 1968. I knew something about espionage and counter-espionage. having spied on the White House for over 20 months. Only the White House Communications Center information that was top secret and mentioned Vietnam War. But having that experience, I knew the newspaper stories didn't add up. There were 12 waiting policemen from the Seattle Police Department who arrested the 4 bombers at a few minutes after 10. The problem was with that is that I was building 2 shifts a day, and I knew that at 10 o'clock the university district only had 1 patrol car, 2 men operating, because they came by my construction site many, many times over the previous months. I knew that the University of Washington, which had the 4th largest police force in the state of Washington, had ample patrol units around the campus itself and the nearby streets. So to have 12 Seattle policemen staked out and waiting, I knew that a tip had been called in. And they were responding to a tip. And it had to be a very good tip to have 12 people waiting in ambush for bombers. I also knew that when 12:35 the night before, one of the bombers had been released on his own personal recognizance, a man named Jeffrey Paul Desmond. I knew that he had to be the informant inside the group. And I knew that this was a bombing that had actually injured an employee of the United States Postal Department in that bomb. And I knew that that was very unusual. And I wanted to find out what it was and what about it was unusual. So after having a late evening breakfast, I walked down to the University of Washington post office and started to investigate it. It wasn't roped off. It wasn't taped off. It was easy to investigate it. And I knew within minutes that a very highly powerful dynamite bomb had been used because of the nature of the broken concrete foundation. So I walked back to the University of Washington, got in my car, drove down, got my rock hammer out of the trunk, and began chipping at it, and figured from my field testing of it, the concrete, that it was over 4,000 psi concrete that had been blown. And at that point, I decided to go find out who bought the dynamite. And the next morning, I did that. By the next afternoon, I knew from having cold called in my fictitious role as a senior FBI agent in Washington, D.C., I cold called all of the places in Western Washington that sold dynamite. And I found a woman who answered the phone at the Harvey Powder Company at the Snohomish County Airport. She told me that she had sold the dynamite. She had sold dynamite to Maud Desmond, who was the mother of Jeffrey Paul Desmond, and had sold it at the direction of a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent who showed his identification to her, and that was Lewis M. Harris, Jr. I decided shortly thereafter to investigate Lewis M. Harris, Jr. and the FBI and its connection with that bombing and others.